corner, shooting, fires. Go! Oh! Take that, Chicago! Take that, Chicago!
Like the best play-by-play broadcasters, Fred McLeod always seemed ready for anything. Dynamic, smooth, and polished, Fred was a perfectionist, on and off the air. And that's why the heart attack that took him from us still doesn't compute. His wife Beth wants to make sure that, like all of Fred's broadcasts, it comes through loud and clear. Beth and Fred McLeod are forever part of our Local 4 family. It was nearly impossible to believe when news of his passing reached us one morning this past September.
And once that shock wore off, many of us turned our thoughts to Beth and how she would cope with such a sudden and tragic loss. Beth recently stopped by Local 4. She sat down to speak with Bernie about what happened that day and how she hopes to obviously honor Fred, but also help so many others.
Yeah, that is her number one priority here, is helping others. As you know, and I don't have to tell anyone, Fred McLeod was a broadcaster first and foremost. He spent many years here in Detroit, more specifically here at Local 4, and for 22 years he was the Pistons TV voice. Then in 2006, his friend Dan Gilbert made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So Fred McLeod and his wife Beth headed to Cleveland, and he became the voice of the Cavaliers, until that voice was silenced last September. Tonight, his wife Beth is sharing his story, hoping it could save someone you love.
Goodbye, Oakland! It's over! The 52-year drought is over!
That was Fred calling the Cavs championship of 2016. His emotions were rather evident. That video was shot by Beth McLeod, his wife of 28 years. Beth and Fred were inseparable. You never referred to one without the other. They had it all. But on September 9th of last year, after hitting some golf balls on a beautiful day in Cleveland, Fred McLeod didn't feel right. So he called Beth, and she knew something was wrong.
So I answer the phone, and I'm like, hey, are you coming home early? And he goes, no, I don't feel well. I go, well, what does that mean? He goes, I have indigestion. He goes, no, I'm taking myself to the ER. And that's where the conversation changed. I didn't realize where he was. Like, I didn't even think it through until he said, I'm taking myself to the ER. And that's where I was like, no, you can't do that. So you need to pull over. And you know my husband, he was pretty determined guy, kind of fast driver. And he's like, I'm taking myself to the ER. And so I made him pull over, and I called 911, and I'm yelling at him to pull over, and I'm yelling at 911, and that was the last time I talked to him.
Just take that into account for a moment. These two, who were glued together for the past 28 years, could feel it coming apart. Fred McLeod was a health nut. He exercised every day, he ate very well, and he took care of himself. And if something bothered him, he was immediately at the doctor's office. So how did this happen? 67-year-old Fred McLeod died of a massive heart attack that day. His numbers put him in a category that could only be termed extremely healthy. But there is one thing everyone must take into account when this happens.
So his grandfather died at 51, his uncle died at 54. And so the doctor said, you cannot run your DNA. And because of Freddie's healthy lifestyle and healthy eating and working out every day, it extended his life a good 10 to 16 years. And in that amount of time, he, watched his kids grow up and graduate and have grandkids. We watched the city of Cleveland celebrate a championship. I mean, that was, in that 16 years, I think how important that was.
But after it happened, she was still lost, still looking for answers. So she asked for an autopsy so that Fred's 3 kids from a previous marriage could know what might lie ahead. The autopsy showed there was a problem with his coronary artery.
The main supply was the one that was blocked. So with a fairly good size piece of plaque.
And that piece of plaque broke off and eventually.
Right, and they said after the autopsy, the one doctor had said he maybe had 4 or 5 minutes to get help. So those 4 or 5 minutes were spent putting his golf clubs away, putting his cart in the front of his,
and calling you.
And calling me.
Yeah. But those moments are critical. Fred complained of indigestion, but it was different, and he decided to drive himself to the hospital. But his attempt was futile. Could he have survived if he had stayed at the golf course? Perhaps. Our own Dr. Frank McGeorge says Roughly 40% of people who have a heart attack do not call an ambulance, and that's the biggest mistake.
I understand people's reluctance to call an ambulance, but number one, they have life-saving equipment if your condition changed. Number two, they can get you to the hospital faster and safer. And number three, many can do an EKG on the way to get a much faster diagnosis.
And that's the biggest reason that Beth McLeod is speaking out now, so others can become aware. Driving yourself is the last thing you should do. And also remember that your DNA has as much to do with your health as anything.
Because if I can just get one of you to go to the doctor, or maybe you get your spouse to go to the doctor, or maybe you get a neighbor to go to the doctor, then I feel like me telling my husband's story will help.
It's been 5 months since Beth McLeod's life changed in an instant. She speaks out now and tells Fred's story for the American Heart Association. But she struggles every day with her loss, and the loneliness can be mind-boggling. Beth has returned to work as a meteorologist at the local Fox station in Cleveland, but the pain is still evident.
There's just a hole in my heart.
We really want to thank Beth McLeod for having the courage to come here and talk about this, and all she simply wants to do is help others. Tonight at 11, she talks about surviving another loss only weeks after losing Fred, how she's dealing with all of this grief, and what the future holds for her. More with Beth McLeod tonight at 11.
You know, the stereotype of a guy is, you know, he doesn't necessarily pay his attention to what his body's telling him, doesn't always want to go to the doctor. Fred was really good about all those things. He was not typical, especially even there at the end, taking himself to the ER.
Yeah, but again, it is your DNA, and that's all they keep saying, you can't outrun it. So if it is a history in your family, get yourself checked. I guess that is the answer, the bottom line to all of this constantly.
And calling that ambulance, I think many of us are a little tentative. We don't want to bother
someone. Want to be a fuss. Yeah. Don't want to make a fool of ourselves.
Plus, she said he had indigestion, so suddenly to have indigestion wasn't that big a deal. But he said it felt different, and that's exactly what it was.
You can see much more of Bernie's conversation with Beth. We put it right now on the homepage of clickondetroit.com. Really, she was so candid and honest about what happened to Fred. Really, really valuable conversation, and she's still in our hearts and thoughts every day.
Every day.
She's walking around the newsroom hugging everyone, just inspiring everyone.
Yeah.